Good morning and good afternoon to you wherever you may be as you tune in today. And thank you for joining us. For those who have joined us for the first time, this webinar series is focused on HR and workplace topics with a lens of culture, DEI, and sustainability. I'm Sonia Sapaban, CEO of OurOffice, where we help organizations with the process, expertise, data, and technology you need to build a more inclusive workplace for everyone to belong and for organizations to be productive. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by our own Dr. Tiffany Ingram, who is a senior D&I advisor with OurOffice, and Randy Corradine, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the nonprofit organization Youth Care. Welcome to you both. Before we get into the meat of this conversation, let's make sure you're familiar with some logistics. We use the Zoom webinar tool, which I think by now everyone on earth is familiar with. This is an interactive webinar, so please use the chat function to provide your comments and any questions you may have. We have one of my colleagues at OurOffice, Anushka Sarif, who will be moderating the questions in real time and chiming in as needed. Thanks in advance, Anushka. We'll answer as many questions as we can throughout and at the end and afterwards if needed, as long as you provide your email address when you ask your question. Also, please note this session is being recorded and will be available after the webinar on our events page, and that's OurOffice, no spaces, just OurOffice.io/events. Last but not least, this webinar is approved for both SHRM and HRCI recertification credits. You will find the activity codes on the last slide. So, Randy and Tiffany, it's great to have you both here. I want to just give each of you a minute or two to introduce yourself and your current role, and then share a little bit about your personal background and experience that has brought you to this moment in your life and your career. Would you like to go first, Randy?
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Randy Corradine, currently serving as the director of, I apologize, my cat is wanting to be in my space right now. Watch out.
We can say hi to your cat too.
Wrong time. I currently work at Youth Care, a nonprofit organization in Seattle, and we are trying to combat youth homelessness. And I myself have a background in the space of equity, specifically within education and the nonprofit sector over about an 18-year span, kind of split with higher ed and education and the nonprofit sector for the last 6 to 7 years. A little bit about me. I guess my purpose is just to see justice in a fair space and try to support and help kids that may have similar backgrounds or look like me, and that's kind of driven my work. So as I say, my why informs my what, so it helps me be clear on what my purpose is, and that's how I try to show up.
And you also teach.
Yeah, I'm an adjunct faculty at City University teaching a social justice class to graduates and undergraduates getting their certs or their BAs and masters in teaching.
Awesome, thank you so much for sharing that. And Tiffany, would you like to share?
Sure. My name is Dr. Tiffany Ingram, as Sonia shared earlier. I'm one of the DEI advisors at OurOffice. My background is also in education, which is kind of where I started. So spent probably the last 12 years or so in Washington, D.C., supporting students with disabilities, their families, and getting equitable access to education and supporting the staff members there. I think what really connects me to this work, I've always worked with folks of difference in every single aspect of my career. And my education background, my doctoral studies looked at the intersectionality of age, race, and gender as it relates to African-American millennial women's career advancement. So just coming out of that research, I'm really empowered to work with organizations through my work at OurOffice and hoping to promote a more inclusive workplace environment where everyone can thrive and actually feel like they belong, but also grow in their careers as well.
Thanks so much. You both have such incredible backgrounds for having this conversation today. It's rare to find professionals who are, in the operational world and just, leading organizations and dealing with the day-to-day, and who are also academics and or have been, in the education arena, where you have to be, I feel like, really know your stuff to be able to teach it to others. And so we're really fortunate to have you both. Since this is Black History Month, it's the last day, but we chose the last day for a good reason, because we want to really look beyond, want to look ahead beyond the month. There's a lot of webinars and blogs and different good materials about what to do during the month, and certainly we have had best practices and just discussions with our partners and customers about how to do that. But it is important to look beyond, and so I want to start by sharing a bit of the history of this Special Recognition Month. Tiffany, since you were introducing yourself, would you like to just give your brief history of this month and how it came to be, and also the way you see the current state of affairs and when we are today?
Sure. So Black History Month didn't start off as a month. In 1926, Dr. Carter G. Woodson instituted the first week-long celebration. Started off as a week-long celebration of awareness of African-American contributions to history. It wasn't until 50 years later that it actually became a month. And February is celebrated as African-American History Month. I think really what we see now in terms of currently the current racial reckoning, as some will say, in 2020, and led that increased surge of wanting to focus in on DEI initiatives in the community, in the workplace. We've heard that for a couple of years, but now we're starting to hear the flip side of some of those DEI initiatives are starting to fizzle out. And we really encourage, the purpose of this discussion really is to talk about what is beyond this month. So while Carter G. Woodson instituted this month in 1926, it really was something for us to elevate our awareness of African-American history and celebrate it throughout, just beyond this year. So I think it is time for leaders to really focus on DEI and go further than just the typical celebrations of Black culture, but really critically examine their role, and particularly in workplaces, needing to create this psychologically safe space for all employees, particularly people of color, folks from marginalized communities, because they are a part of the workplace. And we as leaders have to be committed to their success in not only hiring the best talent, but retaining them as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for pointing out this up and down that we've experienced with D&I. And I think a central question is, is this sustainable this time? And we'll talk a lot more about that, but you triggered something that I think we need to be transparent about as we start this webinar conversation, right? In terms of the intent of our series in general, but especially for this webinar, perhaps more than any other one that we've done in the last 3 years or so. Our intent is to help us all better understand the factors, the strategies and actions that influence workplace culture, so that we can all grow as leaders and feel that we belong as employees. So I want to be sure that everyone is aware that part of our conversation today will be uncomfortable. While it's not our intent to offend anyone, we feel it's necessary to have uncomfortable conversations, especially in this special month, to better understand the problems we're dealing with and to come up with effective and sustainable solutions. Specifically, we want to focus on micro actions that each one of us can take now in our own locus of control. In fact, I'll go as far as to say, if we're not motivated, every one of us, to actually do something after this conversation, then we have not communicated effectively to help solve the issues. And frankly, we're all part of the problem. So I just wanted to say that up front and be transparent about it. And that really leads to talking about the 2023 theme for Black History Month. These themes are, each year it's determined annually by the Association of the Study of African American Life and History. For 2023, it's Black resistance in the past, present, and the future. Now, Brandy, would you like to share what this theme means to you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into it. I think when we think about African American or Black history, I'll refer to it as Black history, and what resistance has looked like to the ongoing oppression of those peoples and those bodies within this country. I just think it's a whirlwind of things that we see, right? I think we laid it out well in the beginning. I think for me, what it means to me is that it's about Black dignity and it's about humanity, right? And Black dignity looks like an act, a way of being. And so when we look at the historical context of all of this, Black resistance is an act or a way of being against all these harmful acts, struggle, and systemic things, right? We persist because we exist. But more so than that, we shape and we influence many things. And so to me, the theme really is an exploration of Black dignity. What does that look like for our activists, for our performers, for our educators, for our lawyers, for our parents, right? For our young folks. So to me, it really kind of dials down to Black dignity and what that act looks like in daily encounters to resist the swarm of all these things.
I appreciate that. Would you like to add to that, Tiffany? It's very well said, Randy. Thank you.
No, I think Randy hit it right on the head in terms of resistance. Our people have been a part of fighting and activism from the beginning. And I think and we still are in every sector. So I think as much as we look back and say, oh, this happened 60 years ago, we're still fighting against the same inequities that we see in the classroom for our kids, we see in the workplace, as people try to build their careers. It's the same, almost the same fight and struggle in every way. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. There is still work that has been done previously. We have to acknowledge that, but there is a long road ahead of us as well. And I think really looking at dignity and really working hard to try to break down these stereotypes of what Black is and what a Black person is. I know for me as a Black millennial woman, professional, like what does a doctor look like, that are all of those things. And I think a lot of times people discredit you, or they don't feel like you should be in that space and have all those different identities. But understanding that people can exist in all these multiple spaces and at these different intersections as well.
Yeah, and I want to, this is the part of the conversation that may start becoming uncomfortable, right? I want to say that, we hear that theme, right? Black resistance, and it sounds like it's a thing for the Black people to do. And the rest of us, right, may not see ourselves part of that. And I want to say that for me, I love what you said, Randy, about shape and influence. For me, the Black resistance is really, and why I feel like I should be part of it as an ally, is that it's about having a, prosperity for all. It's certainly about justice, certainly the right thing to do. But, we all have different levels of connection to that just because of our own lived experience. It's natural. And I think the hardest part for that for me has been to separate myself from a level of, what they call white fragility or, white guilt. So, in our webinars, we talk about the why. We focus a lot about the why, because once everybody, we have an idea of why we should all be involved, then we can talk about the what and the how, and that part gets easy. And the what and the how may be different. We try and suggest some actions, but as long as people get the why, everybody's smart and they can go off and figure out what they can do. So I want to talk about this why for a moment again. Because obviously the justice aspect of that is quite clear, but again, how much everybody feels like they should prioritize that or be part of that differs depending on just, how busy we are in our lives and our lived experiences. Regardless of our own race or ethnicity, the reason I think we should all be active allies to the Black resistance is a few stats that I'll just share, as a nation, right? And then I think Tiffany and Randy, y'all can speak more to the specifics of the gaps that you see and how, you see that, why we should all help with this effort of the resistance. So I'll just share a couple of quick stats. According to the Economic Policy Institute data on racial representation and structural issues, the racial wealth gap in the United States is huge. I knew it existed. I was just surprised by by the scale of it. While the median white family had about $184,000 in family wealth in 2019, the median Black family had only $23,000 in wealth. Now, the median is the number where half the people are above that, half the people are below that. It's not the same as average, but it is a very good indication. This inequity has gotten even worse after the pandemic. This is, again, the data is 2019, so it's worse today, and caused by many factors, including some policies, generational wealth transfers, and racial wage gap due to occupational segregation, and so on. Another high-level stat is the overall unemployment rate that links with the overall wealth numbers. For the United States, the average, this time it's an average, is 5.3% in 2021. Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that the percentage was lower for whites at 4.7% and almost double that for Black and African Americans at 8.6%. Things are getting worse as we're seeing layoffs, because as HBR found in their study, when decisions are made on broad criteria of position and tenure, people think that's sometimes easier to apply and maybe more fair, but women and people of color suffer more. It's a proven fact, there's data on it, because a simple fact, they tend to be in less senior roles and or with less time in those positions. So there's a further erosion, the data shows, of up to 20% in the ratio of white males to these populations. So this is when I talk about prosperity and really living in a healthy, nation where everybody's doing well, and we all benefit from that. I think that's an idea that's probably doesn't need too much debate. Because in this day and age, we can't isolate ourselves. No matter what anybody does, they can't isolate themselves from, where the difficulties or challenges of our society and our environment are. We're all subjected to it, right? I walk outside and, in beautiful Los Angeles, California, and no matter where I am in any neighborhood, they're homeless. There's issues that you can see very much in the open. So that's kind of my perspective and a little bit of data on the why. I know you have a wealth of data on workforce trends, both of you. So would you like to share some of that data, Tiffany? I know you look at workforce trends in particular.
Yeah, most definitely. I think there's a lot of research out there around race in the workplace, the Black experience. When looking at like private sector, companies are really doing a great job in hiring in Black employees at that front line and kind of entry level roles. But we see a drop off in representation at the management levels. Black people just simply aren't there. So they may make up 14% of all employees in an organization, Black people, but then you look at managerial level, that declines down to 7%. Looking at senior manager, VP, senior VP levels, that's only at a 4 or 5%. And for Black women, it's even worse than that, right? So a lot of entry levels, it seems entry level jobs are kind of like a revolving door. While Black employees are making up a high percentage, like maybe 12% of entry level employees, they're leaving their jobs more often than their white counterparts, almost at all levels, which kind of eliminates that talent pool to be able to advance and promote, have those promotions throughout the organization. And I think there's so many studies that talk about the trust kind of deficit between Black employees and their companies, trying to figure out why are Black employees leaving. And there's a lot of survey data around like the microaggressions they also experience in the workplace that kind of makes them feel that they do not belong and may need to exit those roles sooner. But there's also data saying that Black employees are almost like maybe 23% less likely to receive support to advance. So we know that in order to climb that corporate ladder per se, you need managerial support or support from supervisors and other senior leaders. And Black employees really aren't getting those opportunities and that mentorship to be able to advance. And then also when asking employees, this same McKinsey study shows that Black employees report that maybe they're 41% less likely to view the promotion process as fair and equitable. And I saw that also in my research studies and talking to young Black women of like, we have no idea how people advance, have no idea how people get promoted. But you're looking around and magically all these folks are promoted except you. So this study also touched on DEI programs, which, we are, DEI company, Randy works in DEI, but what do Black folks think about DEI initiatives? And there's research out there that kind of feel like they're not effective for Black people. So really thinking about how that programming is supporting all employees. When we survey Black people, they feel like it's not necessarily beneficial to them. Overall, when we look at these trends and advancement, particularly for African Americans in the workplace, the data says, which is very, very disturbing, that it would take 95 years for all Black employees to reach talent parity. That's looking at what essentially a white man's role may be in that organization, and to reach that 12% representation of Black folks at that senior level, it takes 95 years in the private sector. And when you think about that, that's just unrealistic, right? No one's working for 95 years. And so it really shows that there are major barriers that hold back the advancement of Black employees in corporate America. And again, for Black women, we see the same concerns and the Lean In and McKinsey study that was done in 2020 as well around, 49% of Black women feel like their raise makes it harder for them to get a raise, a promotion, or any chance to get ahead. And that's in comparison to 3% of white women. They just literally don't see the workplace through the same lens. And women of color and Black women in particular, again, not getting that same support and encouragement from their managers to be able to, reach that stretch project or try out for that role or even put an application in or get any encouragement and support and advancement. It's also research that shows that they are less likely, Black women are less likely from their managers to kind of even showcase their work or even advocate for opportunities for them to get those stretch projects. So, and we know that managers are crucial in your experience as an employee, and they really truly are gatekeepers in many ways of how you will advance and grow in the organization. And without that consistent manager support, we see Black women in particular just hanging out in those lower tiers, those lower rungs of the company, because there's barriers to get into those mid-level positions and really truly grow within organizations. So there's a plethora of data that's out there that shows, while Black people have jobs at these great organizations, it doesn't seem like they're advancing at the same rates of their peers.
Yeah, and especially at the intersectionality, you point out that, 49% of Black women versus only 3% of white women feel that, it's harder for them to get a raise or a promotion. I want to just say, we have also seen it right in our day-to-day work, some of the underlying reasons, right? You talked about how long it takes to get a promotion. And there's certainly this tie between retention and promotion. And, the data we've seen, specifically a customer just recently, again, we hold everything, of course, anonymous, but we do aggregate data and we try and help everyone, right, who is trying to do this good work to have more inclusive and equitable workplaces, but don't know what to do or where to start. Or after a while, they start plateauing and they don't know what else to do. So the data tells it all. We looked at their data and they could see that there's this what we call structural segregation, occupational structural segregation, where certain levels or certain types of jobs you can clearly see are dominated largely by whites, or in other countries and maybe other races, the majority basically, right? And so when we looked at that, we saw clearly why. I mean, the time to promotion was 18 to 24 months. Typically at the company, just overall for anybody to get promoted. And the retention of, people of color was, and especially I think it was Black people specifically, was less than 18 months. So if somebody is staying there, lasting there less than 18 months, and the promotion time frame is 18 to 24 months, clearly this is one of the reasons even. So I think it's important to try and set aside feeling guilty or I'm a bad person, as a manager, as a leader, and focus on the data, because a lot of this data, it's about unconscious bias. It's about things that just systematically or structurally, not that even anybody purposefully designed it that way, but it is what it is. And we need to just change it, deconstruct it, and deal with it. Randy, do you want to add any of your perspectives on some of the data or gaps that you have seen?
Yeah, I mean, I can add a little bit. I think y'all did such an excellent job of painting a picture of data and how it informs. And I want to lift up a couple things. I think Dr. Ingram said something very important, and I just want to parrot a quote of Malcolm X, which tells us that, the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman, right? And you see that reflected in that data as a microcosm of the systemic things that we see, right? The reason I framed Black dignity is because our country was built on the dehumanization of Black people. So the resistance is a constant process of having to justify the humanity of our existence, right? So I bring all that in to say a couple things, right? These systems are all microcosms of themselves. These reflections, we see it in the data in all these ways. When I dial that down to my own work experience currently at the agency that I work at, and also in the education space, that is reflected in some of the stuff we're seeing when we look at what we're trying to acquire, be that the information, right? Data tells a story, it informs something, and then it allows us to create practices, policies, and procedures that can shift towards an inclusive, equitable culture and then a space of belonging, right? Which is what we're trying to do at Youth Care. But when we talk about all that data scope, you kind of did that broad brush across. I'm just sitting here thinking, like, me and my team, we're building this data collection, but we're also doing these surveys and these engagement points and accessing a lot of this information. And the big thing for us right now is, what does it look like to create a workforce that reflects the racial diversity and lived experience of the young people we walk alongside? Because our goal, not only in service, is to support them and be like guide rails, but also to be windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors for them. And so look at the workforce, especially moving up. That is something we're really looking at, and looking at recruitment and retention practices. How can we create more pathways and access for staff to do that, so that we can show up wholly to our mission? And then the last thing I would say is just the qualitative piece of the data. We talked about the DEI space, and I think that is like the second side of the same coin. There's data, hard data, and also the qualitative data and the experiences of what that looks like day to day in the spaces that we work in, whether it's an agency, private sector, public sector, the classroom, whatever it is. There's also that set of data, and as a combination is a reflection of these things in which we're trying to combat and write to create equitable, inclusive spaces.
Yeah, I love that you talk about, the qualitative side as well, right? There's certainly data and they tell a story, but but it's just, I'll tell a story actually for a minute here about when I arrived in a part of the country, in the 2009 timeframe, major corporation, where as I arrived there, one of the first things that struck me, and I wasn't even responsible for DE&I, I was an engineer in charge of an organization. And when I looked down 5 levels, of the organization, in my organization, below me, I could not see one person of color in charge of anything. There was, or actually there was not that much gender diversity either. I was the first woman in a C-suite in the 50-year history of that organization. And there was one lonely woman down, leading a small group of about 20 people and at the lowest level of the organization. And when I asked why that was, it struck me, and I came with a lived experience that I was, I guess, in tune with that. I wasn't chartered, or that wasn't my main job, to look for these things, but it just seemed very odd. And they said that we can't find people, to put at these levels. And that really also struck me as being odd, because again, the way I came in, from West Coast, a very diverse, one of the most diverse cities in the country, Los Angeles. And when I looked there, I certainly saw a lot of diversity this is, I guess everybody can see on LinkedIn, is that was outside the city of Detroit, which at the time was about 80% Black and African American. And so I pointed that out, that our facility was only 20 miles away. And so I actually set out to do this, which is why then I was given the charge of officially having a second hat of DEI lead. We did a fairly good job. I say fairly because looking back, we could have done more with the amount of time and money, frankly, that was spent. But we were able to actually get more people of, gender diversity, people of color, and also even, other types of diversity. I was always looking at it because, it's not limited to these, right? Sexual orientation, disabilities, and so on. We had great veteran diversity that time. And also age diversity, so all kinds of dimensions of it. But it's just to point out that it was more of a qualitative. At the time, I didn't have any data. I just arrived there, and I could observe it. I could see that when I walked outside and I went to the city, and when I came to the company, it's like we existed on another planet, And so some of these things are just the awareness, and some of us have lived experiences that have that have caused us to be one of those people that just appears to us, and some are not. But there's no reason why we can't all be more aware. I like someone put in the chat that we can't find them is one of my favorite excuses, and they say that they use the word excuse very intentionally. Please feel free to put your comments here on the chat here. So with that, we've talked about the why, and hopefully everyone is now ready to say, okay, what can I do in my own locus of control? Because I see that it's not just, and it's not good for us as a nation, as a society. And so let's talk about what we mean. We titled this Black History and Structural Racism. And I know that terminology, again, the terminology itself makes some people uncomfortable. We have actually had more signups for this webinar than any other webinar we have had in recent times. So there's certainly interest, but I want to make sure that we talk about a definition of this, and also perhaps with an example or two to really talk about how it manifests in the workplace, and results in the stats that we've already shared. So Tiffany, would you like to start with your definition?
Yeah, most definitely. So we look at, through the research, this is from like Aspen Institute talking about structural racism, and we'll talk about how that shows up in the workplace and particularly in hiring. But it really is about a system in which public policies institutional practices and cultural representation and other norms and works in various ways. They're reinforcing to ways to perpetuate a racial group inequity that kind of allows those privileges that are associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to ensure and adapt over time. And I think one of the ways we see this particularly is really with hiring. Even like somebody just shared in the chat, we can't find Black people, but African-American women are the most educated demographic in America. There are more Black women who've gone to college and have advanced degrees than any other population, but people tell us they can't find Black women. And I think a lot of times when it comes to hiring, folks don't like the process. It takes a lot for it to be an equitable process. It's much more easier to say, I know such and such son just graduated from the same university I went to. I know his family. I know his uncle. He'll be a great addition to the team. It's easier to just go grab the people who look like you, who went to the same university you went to, who's from the same area you went to have them join the team. Because you would have to really truly expand your boundaries to really get people who may not look like you to be able to get them to join the team. So a lot of times hiring is, I think for me, one of the blatant things that people don't really talk about, but there's research that shows when you replace a Black person's name, same qualifications, with a person's name that sounds white, they're able to get more interviews than the person who has a stereotypical sounding Black name to people. There is research there that people talk about even interviewing in person, and women and people of color being charged more kind of deemed more harshly on how they show up. Do they look professional enough? Critiquing more on how they look during that interview process, and more questions about whether or not are they truly qualified, even though they have the same degree and levels of experience as someone who may not be a person of color. So for me, structural racism shows up in that. And I've seen job descriptions that say, oh, we're looking for Ivy League candidates. Well, to me, it looks like you're looking for white people candidates, because there's such a small number of people of color who attend those institutions. You might as well just tell us that you're not looking for someone like me. So I do think that is particularly a great place to start for organizations, and really looking at hiring practices and how we can evolve to break down those biases in every level and every process of how that looks, from recruitment to interviewing, who they see in the work, like being able to interview at your organization. Is it a diverse candidate profile? Are you have diverse panelists that are interviewing candidates? There's so much work that can be done just at that hiring process when we start talking about how structural racism connects to the workplace.
100%. In fact, in the chat, someone also added the employers should search more in community and state colleges, not just the top 5 schools. And I'll say that even, there was some, at one point, people were saying in tech, especially, right? We can't find enough computer science majors, that are, people of color. And yet there's data that showed at that time that HBCUs were graduating twice the number of computer science graduates than were being hired. So there were some that were just not being hired. But a lot of times I hear that, well, we are colorblind. We just look for the best people. We're just looking for the best talent. And to me, that sounds a lot like me saying, I'm looking to just go to the best restaurant, but I only look in my 5-mile radius. Now, there are no Michelin-rated restaurants in my 5-mile radius. The best ones may be at 6 miles or 8 miles. And certainly, it takes me doing a little bit more research to find out there is, a Michelin-rated restaurant just, further. But when I'm doing my search on Yelp or wherever it is I look, my favorite app, I limit the radius, right? So it's a lot like this. And again, it's more about awareness. I don't think the majority of people intend to do these things. We just do, and it doesn't make it any better. The uncomfortable part of this is that ignorance is not bliss, and it's not okay. we all must, because of the data we shared, we must commit to do more, because the best talent can be found right beyond where you've always been looking. And if you're not finding them, I have news for you. In this work, I will say unequivocally today, you can quote me if you like, or you can disagree with me if you like, as I'm sure some will. Whoever you're looking for does exist. You're either not finding them because you're not looking where you should be doing, or you're not just looking hard enough, or you can't get them interested in you. Because those that are the people that are, have the right background, there is this top woman, Black engineer, expert in, AI, but they're not willing to come work for you because they have many options. Everybody wants to hire them. So you need to look at yourself and go, am I first looking to find that woman, the Black woman, and also, with the right skills and the right experience. In some points also, you need to look at your requirements and go, do I really, because to your point, Tiffany, right? I mean, we're only perpetuating the issue if they're not enough. It's true that the percentages are not representative, right? They're not as many available as there should be in some skill sets and in some experiences and in some degrees. But that's only because, we've had this structural issue and they're just not given the opportunity to have those experiences. And so we should look at it and say, do I really need 10 years experience or even 5? Maybe I don't. Maybe I can put the additional work in. And why? Because down the line, having this kind of diversity actually does help me be as a tech company, I'll say, ourselves, is that it is worth it to make that investment, because then you're going to have somebody on your team that will build a better app, that will be more helpful to the design of whatever it is you're designing, or the marketing strategy of whatever you're trying to sell. It really works. And there's plenty of data about that. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox now and see if Randy wants to add. So, by the way, we're having lots of great comments. There's a couple of questions that we'll bring up here in a moment, but Randy, I want to give you an opportunity to get on your own soapbox too.
No worries. I don't know if I'm getting on a soapbox, but I think what I would like to bring in this moment is, I know we're isolating structural racism, and I think that's good, but I'm going to give my my teacher hat on real quick and just kind of unpack a little bit, because again, I think we're all coming from different places, and language is one of those access points that helps us have the tools to make sure we're having the same conversation and advancing it. So I just want to kind of hit some definitions. A lot of these definitions support the Aspen definition, but are coming more so from Black activists, from Black feminists, Black educators, and it's a mishmash of that. So it's not my words as much as it's just the knowledge, lived experience of elders and ancestors that I've been able to bring together. But I just want to kind of give this frame real quick that, larger, you have racism, right? But racism breaks down into personal racism, which describes like those private beliefs or prejudices or assumptions and ideas of like an individual, right? And examples of that could be like a prejudice towards others, just based on like race, or just anything that's been internalized in our lived experience, how we've been conditioned through social conditioning and the such. And then you have interpersonal racism, which describes the prejudice and discrimination shown through the attitudes and behaviors of individuals. So that's more widely the form that we see of racism and how it occurs between people and groups daily, right? Those daily interactions, whether that's in the virtual space, the social media space, workspace, or just day-to-day encounters. And then a systemic racism space, I think that the breakdown we had was really awesome, but I just wanted to add that there's that institutional level, right? And then you have structural racism, and I just want to add these to kind of enhance what we're talking about. But in the institutional, like, racism definition that I'm working from, you have that being discriminatory treatment and policies and practices within organizations and institutions. So we've been isolating the hiring practices in higher ed that looks like standardized curriculum, or, what's often referenced, the school to prison pipeline, or right now critical race theory and what that looks like and how it's being legislated and how we're talking about history and omittance and these different things. And then that structural racism is describing the ways that social systems and institutions reinforce and perpetuate racism
Mm.
and inequality. And that goes beyond like that personal bias or those prejudices. And so I say all that to then say, like in the hiring policies and looking at the locus of control, and for those of us who sit in positions and are deciders and have the opportunity to impact and shift. I currently work in the nonprofit sector, and we look at our hiring practices, especially recruitment, or just the interview process. We look at trying to deconstruct what does it look like to allow our BIPOC candidates to come into the space and for us to experience them, right? That professionalism doesn't have to be a reflection of whiteness, but that we're looking for the best qualified candidates as demonstrated through skills and other things. And how do you create processes that allow that to work? Because interviewing is a skill. And if you're educated and you're highly educated, then you're going to be really strong in the demonstration of that skill. Doesn't mean that you're the best qualified candidate. Just means you have a really strong skill set to interview. And when we look at those dehumanization pieces that I talked to earlier, we talk about these systems that perpetually put Black folks and those who've been marginalized in these situations to be stereotyped. It's hard to show up in these spaces if the spaces don't allow us to have equitable stance, to be starting at the same place, to compete for a position around such and such qualified. And so I just add that to the space to also say, I know for us, that's what we're wrestling with really hardly, is we want qualified candidates and people aren't born qualified. And we constantly have to deconstruct these systems that we've all been conditioned, right, to believe what professionalism looks like or what makes a strong interview, and really checking ourselves to be like, well, that's a skill. So how do we look beyond just that skill and look at like other things that demonstrate the qualifications that we're looking for a strong candidate, especially if we're trying to diversify the workforce racially, right? Because that requires inclusion, which requires us to create something new, not reflect what is.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point about the devil is in the details, basically, right? And you got to deconstruct whatever is in, again, your control or your purview or just observables, right? So I'll bring a different example that I just heard this week that really was interesting for me. And I always love when I learn something that I could not have even, it was just totally not on my radar, right? I could not have even thought about it. And this is about health equity, right? I mean, this was about someone who finally noticed in the medical care, field that when you shine a regular light on skin, injuries on Black skin don't show as well when they're trying to document, injuries, whether it's accidents and things or violence, or sometimes issues, just various ways that people sustain injuries. And so, they understood that they need a different kind of light to show, just like not natural or white light, but to really document injuries to Black skin more accurately. This has many implications, in terms of, again, policies and things, and, even the criminal justice system. And the treatments, that the person receives. So this is like, when I learned that, I was like, holy cow, I never thought about this issue, right? Or the color of Band-Aid, not having different color Band-Aids, right? Because the majority is in the majority and doesn't have that lived experience, it's just natural that things get designed and provided that serve the majority. And this is not, like, to begin with, I mean, to think that way is not the majority's fault. It is their fault not to deconstruct it and not to have other people that have other lived experiences to also look at a product before it's marketed, to also look at the job description before it's consumed by candidates, to also look at, what the interview process is experienced by the person. A lot of people tell me, oh, we make a lot of offers, we try and throughout the hiring process, just at the end, we don't get acceptances. Again, those best candidates, they probably detect through the interview and through the rest of the process that this isn't a place where they're going to be very comfortable. We have a question also, I think earlier that, about how do you respond to a leader who says, if you just work hard, you'll make it. It doesn't matter what your race is.
I can start us off. I guess it goes back into some of the definitions that we talked about, and talked about the dehumanization of Blackness and Black people, and these stereotypes and these assumptions about how that looks or shows up. Because I would say the myth of mediocrity is not real, right? Like in this country, you can't just, the bootstrap argument doesn't work, because if you strap up your boots but you ain't got no soles, it don't matter, right? And so when we talk about these equitable systems, and we talk about systemic and structural racism, it's power plus prejudice, right? And how that is exercised. So equity is what we need. That is a diversity argument, which reinforces a system to just say, well, just work hard. If you just work hard. And it's like, nah, that's not how that works, because my Blackness in this country is seen a certain way, right? Because we were dehumanized in the sense of our existence, right? It's in legislation, right? The 3/4 rule, right? So that carries into the ideas. So I would say to that leader, like, let's unpack that. Let's really talk about what equity looks like, how to create equitable spaces, and how do you coach and support and qualify a candidate so that that is an actual experience that's available to them, versus just dismissing, like, hey, racism is real and it's hard for me to do these things because it ain't the same for me like it is for everybody else. Well, just work harder. That creates lack of psychological safety, and it also impacts a lot of what we call sweat equity, right? All the things when it comes to DEI stuff that we give and we're not credited for, and isn't considered an advancement in some instances. But I would say the myth of mediocrity is not real, and the bootstraps metaphor is not the response. So I would say listen and believe your staff, and then learn and grow together to change the systems and the practices.
Yeah, I love that, Randy. I'll just say that absolutely, one of my best engineers who, I gave a lot of promotions to, despite our policies that said, unless you have an engineering degree, you cannot be a certain grade, right? And this person did not have a degree. They had, at a young age, person of color, they had some lived experiences, and they had kids very early, and they just couldn't make time. I asked them, I said, well, can't you just go finish this last year and get your engineering degree? And they just said, listen, I just can't do it. I have 5 kids, and I just, but, he had learned, and it was one of our best engineers. So I went against those policies, and just said, look, I'm exercising my, if there's, one thing my little 2 letters, VP letters in front of my name mean, it means hopefully I can, give this person their due title, because they were doing the job. We just couldn't give them the title and the comp to go with it, because there was a policy that said you had to have a degree. And I said, look, I'm an engineer with several degrees. Can I just say he's good enough, so it took some process, but at the end we were able to do that. Or a secretary, I had one of my best secretaries ever, who I knew was, had aspirations and skills beyond her administrative roles, which was very important too. But I mean, she wanted to do more. Today, she is, as I sit here, she's a director of supply chain at one of the previous companies I was at here in LA. And that's because I had to go against saying that whatever you're going to go study for educational reimbursement, it had to be related to your current job. Her current job was admin job, but she wanted to be in supply chain, and she was really good at dealing with our vendors, and so we had to get an exception to let her. So this is, I think, to make it real, right? And I'd like to ask you, in the last few minutes we have, just maybe a couple of minutes each, talk about, and then we're going to show the Sherman, the slide with the Sherman, the HRCI codes as well. But what do you think about some specific, you talk about safe spaces, we talk about affinity groups or ERGs, and what ways to really, if you want to be intentional and find out more about these systemic or structural inequities and how to deal with them, what are some best ways to do that in the workplace? Tiffany or Randy, either one of you can share. Yeah, there's lots of comments coming into the
Yeah, there's some.
and thank you. I'm keeping track of it too, but most people are thanking us. But please share your own experiences and actions that you would suggest, and we'll say it on the air. In this environment, only we can see, the panelists can see the comments. So please feel free to add. And I think if they put to everyone, of course, I think everyone can see it, but there's some that are just to the panelists. So feel free to put it just to us or to everyone. Go ahead, Tiffany.
I mean, I think the role of affinity groups and ERGs can take their own kind of definition and grow and kind of mission. It depends on what you want to do. I think affinity groups are a good space for people to feel like they have this community of people to rally around their lived experience at whatever organization. But I do like this idea of employee resource groups, or even business resource groups, as some people call them, of really creating a space to create this pushback even within your organization of saying, hey, you say you're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, so your next round of hiring, remember that. And we are going to participate. We are going to hold our senior executives to what they say in this space when you say that you're hiring. Because you say this is the standard, and we're going to make sure that you meet that. So not only having spaces where people can have that sense of community and chat about things, but also really create real change. And I think one of the things that people need to understand is that it takes more than just the Black people in the organization, or the white people, or the women, or this or that. It really takes everyone to create change. And everybody has an element of a leader within them, and they have the ability to influence change, even if they aren't the person who actually signs off on that change. But I do think that the roles of affinity groups and kind of employee resource groups can evolve to be something where they can actually really be change makers if you do it correctly. If you're positioned and you have a senior level executive sponsor that cares about the work, you can really truly leverage change within your workplace and create that space of inclusivity that you would want to be a part of, and ensure that you're recruiting more people of diverse populations to the organization as well.
Yeah, and that's so important. As you know, Tiffany, we insist that when you form ERGs, that, certainly they need to have their community. They need to have an executive sponsor that can listen to inputs, not necessarily be in all their meetings or anything, because you do want to create that community, but be there to have, periodic meetings and see what's coming out of what they're identifying as issues, what they're identifying as actions they want to take. In fact, we provide a tool, in our tool, the ERG groups capability, the module, and I'll, in full transparency, Randy Cordin, Youth Care, and Randy, our customer of OurOffice. So you know what we're talking about. There is a capability, not just for groups to obviously, have conversations and schedule events and so on, which is a good thing for ERGs to do, but they can take on actions. So when the organization has a DEI plan or a workplace culture plan or any plan, strategic plan, and has some, key objectives, they can actually link through the tool and see those actions and take them on. They can create their own actions. They can also take on KPIs, key performance indicators that they want to be part of. And we encourage that. If the ERG really is there to create a community, that community is very valuable to the organization as well. Certainly for their own sense of belonging, and that's really important. But beyond that, they'll even feel better and find more satisfaction themselves in being able to influence, beyond their own just community get together. Last word, I'm going to put up the HRCI and SHRM recertification information here. But meanwhile, Randy, you get the last word. Tell us your last takeaway. And people are thanking you all over the place in this chat. But please also share, just the last word. What should people do when they leave here?
Yeah, man, the last word. That's a lot of pressure, Dr. Ingrid. I think you hit a lot to the ERGs and stuff, so I think that's great. As a takeaway to folks, I guess when we talk about like building resiliency and thinking of the positions that we hold and really bringing it to that micro level, like that locus of control is like whatever you can do, coach and decide to like resilience. And that's really that way of being, right? Have your beliefs, your values, all that stuff, commit to DEI, right? And then have your actions reflect that, and then create these ways of being as practice to do that. Like that's the stuff we could do, right? So a good example tying back to something earlier was like we talk about DEI at this moment, there's this fatigue and there's this reality that it's becoming performative, right? Like community agreements. Glenn Singleton created that in the educational space. Now it's adopted as a best practice, and it's been so standardized that the source of it was lost. The compasses and the company, some of these other tools that he creates to say this is a practical tool that creates a way of being when the collective is acting within it and holding the integrity. Just reciting his starting points is not a way of being. And so for all of us, that's what I would say is listen more, lean into what our staff are telling us, co-create. And when we think of ERGs and stuff like that, give responsibility, deciding power, structures like that. But for us, it is really looking at like, how do we create ways of being and show up to the values we hold, right? Because that's where the distinction of performative is. You can say a lot of things, but if we're not walking in it, I think that that's where it matters. And it starts with us. Like if we're not modeling it, we're not creating opportunities, releasing opportunities, or spending our privilege for those of us that have it, then the perpetuation and the system in itself just kind of keeps going. It really takes sacrifice from us who have positionality and power to really shift some of those things. And some of them are really simple, like coaching towards equity, just how you build those things into practices of meetings and other spaces. And so sometimes it isn't the big transformational things in just policy. Sometimes it's just a practice in your staff meeting, right? Sometimes it's just the way that you build awareness with somebody that you supervise, so on and so forth. So that would kind of be what I have to close, and hope it bookended us, but I appreciate the opportunity to be in the space.
Thank you so much. We could go on forever. Be intentional, question everything, take action. That's the bottom line. Thank you so much. We went a couple of minutes over. It's the first time, but we had to. Take care. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll see you in a future webinar. Bye-bye.